It's really hard to believe that we are just a couple of months away from the time of year where everyone's goodwill and generosity explode onto the scene. And as we're talking about being a generous people this week, it dawned on me that there are a number of great stories out there that remind us what it means to be generous. One of my favorites I've read recently, there's the story of a pastor who was serving at a parish, and they had multiple Christmas Eve services, and he finished the first one, and there were a few hours between that service and the next one that he had to oversee, and so he decided instead of just spending time at the church, he would go out and mingle among folks and visit some of the stores that were open late into the evening for those last-minute shoppers. And somewhere along the line, he came across a florist who was still open. And so he walked inside and was chatting with some folks and observing kind of what was going on. And not long after he entered the store, a little boy, probably no older than 10 years old, walks in. And his clothes were sort of a shamble, not the heaviest coat that he should have been wearing for that cold of an evening. And his tennis shoes were clearly maybe a size maybe too small for him, had some holes in them. But this boy walked into the store and went right to the counter, walked right up to the owner of that flower shop and said, "I have a dime, and I was wondering if you had any roses that I could buy for my mom." The florist said, "Let me check and see what I have available." And the florist turned around, and meanwhile, these folks in the store are beginning to take note of what's happening, and they're watching and they're waiting to see how is this florist going to respond to this situation. The florist turns back around to the young boy and he said, "You're in luck. We have a special just on Christmas Eve for little boys who want to buy roses for their mom." And so he took that dime from that little boy and he placed in that boy's hands a dozen fresh red roses. This is a true story. I was blown away by this. There's something about that time of year that brings out some of that goodwill in us that sometimes throughout the year we forget or we neglect. And as I was thinking about that, my mind turned to the book of James. And in James chapter 2, he talks about how important it is we recognize that it's not just about wishing goodwill on people, but actually giving of ourselves. Giving of ourselves in such a way that might hurt a little bit, to bless someone else. In James chapter 2, verse 14, it says, "What good is it, my brothers, if someone says that he has faith but does not have works?" And he goes on to say, if you see someone who's hungry or cold and in need of clothing, and you simply say, "Go in peace, be warmed and filled," without giving them the things that you have to help them, what good is that? A faith without works is dead. And when it comes to being a generous people, that's sort of the crux of the matter there. If you go on and read in James chapter 5, there's a great warning, and it's a very strong warning in James chapter 5 against the wealth that we tend to try to accumulate for ourselves. Jesus talks about, it's easier for the camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a wealthy person to enter heaven. And that's not to say it's completely impossible, but the reality is it's really hard when our minds are so wrapped up in wealth for ourselves rather than blessings to give to others. I want to encourage you this week as we think about generosity to not allow that to become a one-time-a-year thing, but to become a very integral part of who we are. To ask ourselves, what is it that I have that I don't need that someone else could be blessed by? Whether it was youth group on Sunday where we talked about some of the ways they can give of their possessions or things, or with the Bible studies where we began to look at the needs of our community, I want to encourage you to look around yourself in your immediate vicinity, maybe even your very neighbors next door, and say, what can I do? What can I give to them that's going to show that this faith of mine of receiving God's love has truly impacted my life in such a way to change how I view the stuff that I have that I can bless them with. I hope you have a good week, and we'll look forward to seeing you very soon.